Good morning. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you today. Thanks to Jared for being able to help me with this. I'm in South Carolina and recording this message for you, and Jared's going to move my slides for me, so you'll hear me saying next slide along the way. But we're going to be talking today about the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is a book about a spiritual journey, a journey that all of us need to make in our own lives, because there are things that bother us, and we'll see a lot about this, about Habakkuk along the way as well. Next slide. To give you a little bit of a background, in 609, Josiah, who'd been a very good king, had been killed on the way to stop Egypt from doing something. And the Egyptians came back and they appointed a king by the name of Jehoiakim to rule. Jehoiakim was a very, very evil man. He had murdered a lot of people. I'm told he also was involved in a lot of incest and had sex with a lot of different people, killed their husbands. The justices were a problem. We're going to see a lot about that as well. And then after 2 years, apparently in that time frame, Habakkuk began to do his prophecy. And there's a lot of things that bothered him, just like today for us. The next slide. Habakkuk began his book with a complaint. And he says, "How long, O Lord, must I cry for help, but you don't listen? I cry out to you violence, but you do not save." The word violence is in quotes because it means that's kind of like saying mugger or attacker or something that says, I'm in trouble and I need a lot of help, but God, you're not saving. So I don't know what's going on. And why, next slide, why do you make me look at injustice? And why do you tolerate wrongdoing that's going on all around me? Destruction, violence are before me. There is strife and there is conflict abounds. Therefore, the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Look at those red words. Does that sound contemporary? Does that sound like a lot of what's going on in our own society right now? A lot of people are concerned about some injustices that are taking place among a lot of people of color. I also, when you talk about strife and conflict, I have a police officer friend who feels also a sense of conflict, and in conflict, he's a good man, but there's just a lot of things going on, and he understands that there's a lot of problems with justice as well. But at the same time, these are things that are going on, and why? What is he doing? What is Habakkuk doing about this? He's going to God and saying, God, I don't understand. Why is this happening? You're going to have to do something about this. And I think it comes down to the fact that, in America, we're allowed to protest, we're allowed to do a lot of things, and to concern ourselves with that. There's a lot of great things going on. There's some bad things going on both sides of things. But there's just a lot of things going on. And I know that a lot of us are very concerned. Our hearts are broken because of the death of so many unarmed black men going on in our country at this particular point in time, even last week. And so the fact that we feel like justice is perverted, no one gets justice, and we complain about that, we talk about this, we have all these concerns. This is what Habakkuk is going on. This is what Jehoiakim's kingship had done to the justice that had gone on previously with the king Josiah, who had been a great king. And so Habakkuk is just really, it's gone 2 years now, it's gone on, and it just hasn't stopped. He is really, really upset. He's going to God and he's saying, why? Why? And I think that's a lot of the concern, a lot of question, a lot of us is why? Why is this going on? What can be done about it? And we have a lot of solutions, but bottom line, the solution really comes down to the very thing that Habakkuk's doing, is going to God. And all of us who are spiritual, that is really the ultimate issue. It's God who changes men's hearts. It's not the law that doesn't change men's hearts. It's not even our protests, even though it's right to do so. It's not going to change men's hearts. Only God can change men's hearts and or move circumstances to make that happen. And that's what we're going to hear now. And so he's saying, God, what are you going to do about this? Next slide. And God answers. God says in verse 5, Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. So I'm about to tell you what's going to happen. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless, next slide, by the way, sorry. The Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves, and they promote their own honor. God's solution that Habakkuk is concerned about all the injustice going on. God says, I've got it. I'm sending the Babylonians in, and there's going to be damage. These people are ruthless, impetuous. It goes on later on to describe that their horses are faster than leopards. They're just a fierce people, ruthless, as he says here. They are feared, they're dreaded. He says, you know what? They're their own law. They don't listen to anyone else, even God. And they promote their own honor. They aren't talking about giving God any honor at all. And so the next slide, please. Habakkuk then says, you know, God, ultimately, I've got a big problem with your solution. Your solution is worse than the cure. And Habakkuk's second complaint is, God, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. O Lord, you have appointed them to execute justice. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Next slide. Habakkuk goes on. It says, God, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. What this says about Habakkuk is he has a very high view of God. He says that he understands God to be holy, holy, holy. He understands God to be the true justice. He understands God to be the solution. He understands God to be above everything and to be the one who's in charge of everything. And he says, you can't tolerate wrongdoing. So then why? Why do you tolerate the treacherous? I have the same question I had before, but now I got it about the Babylonians. Why do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? As bad as we are, we're not as bad as the Babylonians. You know, your solution, I've got a big problem with your solution. It's why? I don't understand God. I think there's a lot of times that men and women and of all ages question what is God doing and don't really, and feel like sometimes God does not care. And sometimes God is not moving. And yet God is saying, you will see what God is saying about all this. Let's go to the next slide. Habakkuk goes on with his complaint and he asks this question. Is he, the Babylonian, is he to keep on, the Babylonian nation, to keep on emptying his nest and destroying nations without mercy? Is that what's going to go on with this people? Next slide. Habakkuk chapter 2 starts with Habakkuk saying, listen, God, I'm going to stand my watch. I'm going to go station myself on the ramparts. I'm going to go to the highest place I know in the city. And I'm going to look to see what he's going to say to me, what God is going to say to me, and what answer I'm to give to this complaint. How am I going to answer this question to myself? And if somebody asks me, how am I going to answer this question? What am I going to do? Tell me, God. I need to know. I need to know. And I think that, we need to really ask that question of God. And how are we going to find that out? By reading scriptures like this and by understanding all of what God's concerns are all over. And so he says, I want to know, how am I going to answer what I'm really concerned about? And then the Lord answered him in the next slide in verse 2. The Lord replied, I want you to write down the revelation I'm about to give you. And I want you to write it down plain, large print, basically, on tablets. Not one, but more than one tablet, so that a herald can run with it. Literally, it says, so one who runs can read it. So it's talking about someone who's able to run and go and telling other people what's going to happen. And then the next slide. And God says, this revelation I'm about to give you and tell you what's happening, it awaits an appointed time. I know when it's going to happen. I know how it's going to happen. I'm in control of all this. And this revelation I'm going to give you, it speaks to the end, and it will not prove false. And though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come. It will not delay. And so he's about to give him a revelation. So remember, what is Habakkuk's concern? Habakkuk's concerned about injustice, violence, strife, conflict. God says, I'm sending the Babylonians. Habakkuk says, this is a bigger problem. I don't see how they can really fix this problem. This is really, really bad. And God says, okay, I'm going to give you a revelation. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. And even though it may seem like it's going to take a while, though wait for it. It will linger. Though it takes some time, I want you to wait for it. It will certainly come, and it will not delay. Next slide. And then he says, see, the enemy is puffed up. Literally it says, see, he is puffed up. And some people think it's talking about somebody else, but in the context, it's really, as NIV sometimes, it depends on translation, records it. The enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright. You're right. They are not upright. And even their desires are wrong. But I will tell you, here is the most important principle. But the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Your translation in the NIV may record this as, but the righteous will live by his faith. This is the Greek translation of it. The Hebrew translation doesn't really have a word specifically for faith. It has a word for faithfulness, which is based on faith. And if you really understand the New Testament concept of faith, faith needs to lead to faithfulness, or it's not really saving faith. It's not really faith in God at all if it doesn't result in us being faithful to God. And so either way, the translation is correct, whether it's faith or faithfulness. And it's really the Greek translation that's often quoted in the New Testament. The righteous will live by his faith. But when you understand what the New Testament is talking about, it's still talking about the concept of faithfulness based upon your faith. Faith without works is dead, is what James says, and then others as well. And so he tells him all this, and he gives them a number of things that are little pericopes about what's going to happen to the Babylonians. And sometime you can read this whole second chapter, but I'm going to give you a little idea about one of the next chapter. And Habakkuk chapter 6 is when God is telling this particular part of it. There are others as well, but this one will suffice. Will not all of them taunt him with ridicule and scorn, saying, woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. How long must this go on? Again, they're talking about the Babylonians. Next slide. And Habakkuk, and he says there in verse 7, God is saying to Habakkuk, the part of the revelation to him is saying, will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey. You have preyed upon others, and these nations that you've overcome, some of them are going to rise up, and you will become their prey. And so you think you won't be defeated, but I'm telling you that the people you gathering nations, because you've plundered many nations, these people who are left will plunder you. And so God is saying, listen, Habakkuk, I want you to understand, the Babylonians are going to get their due too. But I am using the Babylonians to deal with all of the injustice and all the things that are going wrong. It have been going on for a long time, with a couple of breaks by people like Josiah and Hezekiah. And he says, these are terrible times, but I'm sending the Babylonians along. And they're going to get what they deserve later on. And go to the next slide. So Habakkuk in verse chapter 3, this is the great passages that go on to chapter 3. He says, Lord, I've heard of your fame, and I stand in awe of your deeds. Repeat them in our day, and in our time, make your deeds known. We want to see you work, God. We want to see you work. And in your wrath, in your dealing with us, please remember mercy. And so Habakkuk is saying, okay, I understand now what's happening with you, and the Babylonians are going to get their due. And so he's coming to God, and he says, God, I've heard of your deeds. I stand in awe of you. And we go down then to verse 16, next slide. In Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 16, he says, I heard and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound, and decay crept into my bones, and my legs trembled. When I think about what's going to happen with the Babylonians when they come into our country, and what I know that they've done, he says, I tell you, I am scared. And this is scary. It's really overpowering. And I think, what we need to see here is that God is working, and he's not working in a way that we would want him to. He's not working. It's God, what we want you to do is we want you to fix this, but we don't want to suffer as a result. Habakkuk is saying, hey, you know what? It looks like I'm gonna suffer here, because and as are a number of other people. And the very first time that Babylonians came, they took a number of royal people away. That's and 2 years later is when the Babylonians came. 2 years after Habakkuk's prophecy, the Babylonians came, and they didn't destroy the city. They extracted some tribute, and Daniel and a lot of other royal people, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and others left and were held hostage there in Babylon, and later used as well. So Habakkuk is looking at all this, and he's saying, this is really scary. And then in Habakkuk verse 16, he says, yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come upon the nation invading us. This is going to be hard. This is going to be very difficult. But God, I know you've already told me they're going to get their due. So I'm going to wait patiently for that to happen, for the Babylonians to get their due. Well, what you should know is it was 65 years later that the Babylonians got their due, when the Medes and the Persians overran and defeated Babylon. And so 65 years later, he's going to be waiting a long time. And in fact, it may not happen in his lifetime. There are a lot of concerns we have about justice, and we work toward those things. And you remember that Martin Luther King was talking about one day, little black children and everybody would, it wasn't now, it may be our grandchildren, it may be our great-grandchildren. This is going to happen somewhat later. I think we need to understand that these are things that he says, I'm going to wait patiently, but you know what? He may have died before this actually happened. I don't know how old Habakkuk was. It's not told, but he's a guy that probably will not see what he's hoping to see in his life. I think there may be things that we hope to see that may not happen in our lifetime as well, but yet we work for that. We work for our children, for our grandchildren, so that their life will be better. We try to make sure that justice prevails. And let's look at the next verse, because this is really the high point of this book. Habakkuk, next slide, chapter 3, verse 17. And he says this, and though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, and though the olive crop fails, and the figs produce no food, and though there are sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls, though I may be totally wiped out, and not have anything to show for all that I've done and all that I've built, I may lose it all. That's a great possibility with the Babylonians coming. I may lose everything I have, everything I've relied on as far as surviving. He says, and though this happens, next slide. Yet, in verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, and I will be joyful in God, my Savior. He places me on high points. this is the amazing thing. This is a great ending to the beginning. Why? Why do I am constantly looking at injustice? Why am all these things going on? And yet your solution is worse than the problem. I don't see how you're working, God. Is not really, and I think there's a lot of things that God is doing that we do not understand. We don't even know how he's working, and yet he is always working. And yet we need to come to the point like Habakkuk to simply say, God, it may not happen in my lifetime, but I will tell you this: I will never leave you. And I lose everything, I'm telling you, God, I'm still going to rejoice. I'm still going to rely on you. And I know that the only joy I have in life is to have a relationship with you. That is what God is telling Habakkuk. And Habakkuk has gone from accusing God, not understanding what God is doing, questioning God, given an answer about how the Babylonians will be punished. And yet he comes to the point that says, you know what? It doesn't really matter what happens to me, because God, I trust you. I know that in all things, you are a lot smarter and wiser than me. Let me close with another situation. Go to the next slide. In Luke 18, Jesus, it says, told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and never give up. Always pray and never give up. And he told this parable. I'm going to tell you the parable rather than read it to you. He talks about a judge, and it says 3 times in the parable that he had no regard for man or God. And yet there was a widow who kept coming to him, asking for justice on her case, kept coming. And it says that all those times, it says all that, but he just didn't do anything. And finally, he gets to the point, he says, I'm going to give her justice because she's going to wear me out with asking all this justice. Even though I have no regard for God, even though I have no regard for man, I will give this woman justice because she is bothering me, and I'm going to do what she wants me to do. That's the parable that Jesus told, to tell people they should pray and not give up. And so we might have a lot of interpretations to that parable, but the real situation is Jesus has the answer to this parable. He tells us the meaning of the parable. You go down to verse 6, next slide. And in verse 6, the Lord said, listen to what this unjust judge says. I don't have regard for man or God, and yet I'm going to give this woman her justice that she is asking for because she's going to wear me out without. And will not God, verse 7, and will not God bring about justice to his chosen ones, to his people, to the people that he has chosen, who have a relationship with him? And he says, for his chosen one who cry out to him day and night, will he keep putting them off? And so here's the question that needs to be asked at this point. Habakkuk made a big, long spiritual journey. Let me ask you this. Is the things that are going on bothering you so much that you're not able to pray? Are things going on that has really caused you to question God? And you should always know that God is always in control. And we need to be people like he's talking about here, who will pray and not give up. And he says, God will bring about justice for his people who cry out to him day and night. Will he keep putting them off? He says. Next slide. Luke 18 says, I tell you, he will see that they get justice and quickly. You know, we need to understand this, that God's time is different than ours. One day is 1,000 years for him. 1,000 years are like a day to him. And so he says they're going to get justice and going to get it quickly. God is always working to bring about the justice that we so much want to see in our country and around the world, frankly. And God says, I will see it. And what we need to be are the people who keep praying day and night for justice, day and night, asking God to move, to act, And yet to come to the point that saying, God, I trust you're working, and I may not know it. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I trust that you're going to do that. And it may not happen in my lifetime. It may be like Habakkuk. I may lose everything. I may not get any of the things that I think should be done, but I'm praying that it will happen. And God says, I will see they get justice, and it will quickly. But he asked this next very important question, and we close with this thought. And it's the question we most need to answer today. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Habakkuk had to make a journey spiritually. He had to get from questioning God to understanding what God is going to do and not liking it, to questioning God, why are you doing this? And then God saying, listen, what your job is to be righteous and live by faith. Live by faithfulness. That's what you're supposed to be doing. Trust in me. And then he gives him a revelation. These things are going to happen. And then he gets to the point where he's finally understanding that the ultimate thing he needs to be concerned about, above all other things, is that God is the one who's going to change men's hearts. God is the one who's going to bring about justice. God is the one who is the solution to all we face. But the real question for all of us today is, will he find faith on the earth when he comes again? The question for you and for me is, do we have the faith of Habakkuk that he ends his message with? Are we going to say, it doesn't matter what happens to me, the more important thing is I'm going to rejoice in God. I'm going to have a great relationship with God, and I'm going to trust him above all things. And I want to make sure that when Jesus comes again, if he comes in my life, or if I die before he comes, I need to make sure, God, that you will know that I have faith in you above all things. May God give us the hearts that we need to really trust in him in spite of, not because of, but in spite of what we see. We're going to always trust in God. And may God bless you and have a great day today.